Welcome classic rock fans to a worst to best video, and today we're looking at the albums of Iron Maiden. This is actually a re-ranking video, to be honest with you, because since the release of Senjutsu last year, all the pieces have kind of moved about on the board. So I thought I'd revisit that original ranking video of mine by listening to all those albums once more avidly this week, and decide whether, first of all, have I changed my mind about any of these records, and secondly, how does adding Senjutsu into the ranking affect everything. Anyway, as always, I'll ask you to click like, subscribe and check that bell to get notified of any future uploads. And whilst you're down there, please be sure to check out some of the links for ways you can support the sterling work done at Classic Album Review. It's all much appreciated. Anyway, let's get on with it, shall we? Number 17 is Virtual 11 from 1998. This originally ranked at number 16, and because of the inclusion of Senjutsu, it has been pushed down a slot. This, of course, is the famous Blaze Bayley era, a poor chap that gets a lot of flack simply for not being Bruce Dickinson. One thing this album does establish, though, is how much, as Maiden fans, we miss Dickinson's voice. But this album overall is a mixed bag, to say the least. One critic said it sucks worse than an aeroplane toilet, which I think is a tad unfair. It does have some merit. There's some wonderful soloing on this record, and I love the track Educated Fool, and I believe The Klansman is also on this one, which is a wonderful number. But The Angel and The Gambler, not so much, I'm afraid. But it is a dark and brooding album. I think Gary Bushell said it's about as cheerful as Ibsen with hemorrhoids. But this is still at the bottom of the pile for me. There doesn't seem to be, the quality of the songwriting isn't quite there. A lot of the songs seem to be unnecessarily elongated, and there's no unifying theme or anything around which the tracks are organised. It's not a particularly enjoyable album to listen to. Number 16 is X Factor from 1995. This originally ranked at number 14 on my original list. The critics have argued that this is just a self-indulgent dirge that just doesn't quite work. Interestingly, though, Steve Harris has listed this as one of his favourite Maiden albums. It's a challenging listen, to be honest with you. I think what the band needed at this time is something more anthemic, something more Maiden-esque. And what brings this album down is the content itself. At 70 minutes, it's way too long, and the production is subpar as well. The best tracks on this album are easily the first four, I think. Number 15 is No Prayer for the Dying from 1990, original ranking at number 15. This album lacks a certain spark. A lot of the material seems a tad mediocre, to be honest with you. It creaks under the weight of the band's indifference. I think Adrian Smith had already jumped ship by the time this album came out. Holy Smoke is a great song. It's a fun number, as well as Tail Gunner. I mean, I love Tail Gunner. For me, it's one of the highlights of this record. Martin Popoff said of this record that the band were trying to build shoddy replicas of bold anthems on this album. I think Mother Russia is a dreadful number. This is very much a back to basics album. It feels like a very watered down version of Iron Maiden. And number 14 is Dance of Death from 2003, which originally came in at number 13. I think this album lacks conviction, in my opinion, although it does contain the wonderful First World War epic. Nevertheless, the songs aren't drawn out unnecessarily. There's a few tracks on here that just don't work for me, but nothing embarrassing like The Angel and The Gambler, or anything that's just completely dull like the second half of the X Factor. I think this is the last album that has that classic Maiden sound before the band go all proggy on us. Number 13 is A Matter of Life and Death from 2006, which originally ranked at number 12. I think this is a fascinating album. It comes across as a tract on age and mortality. Maybe the band were just feeling it at this point. It has a rather downbeat and slower feel to this album. I find myself missing those valiant tales drawn from literature and the history books that we've come to associate with Iron Maiden. Standout tracks for me, I love the songs The Longest Day and The Reincarnation of Benjamin Brieg. Overall, this is a pretty decent album. It's a mature Maiden album. The rather dark and ponderous feel to this the band were pursuing for the X Factor, but it actually works quite well on this record. Number 12 is The Final Frontier from 2010. Its original place on my ranking was number 9. This album is a sprawling affair and feels over long. And nevertheless, there is some quality material on this album. Most of the tracks falling within the paradigms of good to absolutely great. This does seem to be a bit of a Marmite album. A lot of Maiden fans I speak to feel it's just not as great as it could have been But one thing I enjoy about Maiden is they're not afraid to experiment, and I love all the progressive elements that seem to become increasingly pronounced as this band go on, probably due to Steve Harris's love of Yes and Jethro Tull and those sort of bands. But this album does have a certain ferocity. I think at times they seem to be wanting to out-Metallica, to be honest with you. Mother of Mercy is fantastic, and The Alchemist are the standout tracks on this record. Number 11 is Fear of the Dark from 1992. This originally ranked at number 8 on my list. After the artistic disappointment, There Was No Prayer for the Dying, that the band really needed to up their game. John Tucker said that Maiden really began to feel the presence of bands like Dream Theater waiting in the wings, and begin to feel a little bit threatened by that, I suspect. This sees Steve Harris as co-produced, and I think this was the last album made before Bruce Dickinson left. But this has an energy and a ferocity, I think, which was well needed after the previous album. Outstanding tracks on this album, in my opinion, are Afraid to Shoot Strangers, From Here to Eternity, and Childhood's End. All definitely worth listening. Overall, I think this album is a great send-off for Bruce. Number 10 is Somewhere in Time from 1996, which was originally placed at number 7. I really do like this album, but I feel this album tends to creak and strain under the weight of artistic tensions. I believe Bruce Dickinson didn't contribute anything to this record in terms of the writing. And sonically, it sounds very different from that holy trinity of 1980s Maiden albums. We're talking, of course, Number of the Beast, Powerslave, and Peace of Mind. And that might well be due to the inclusion of synths and synth guitars, of course. But this album does boast some wonderful, wonderful tracks. Stranger in a Strange Land would be one of them. Alexander the Great feels a little bit forced. It's almost as if somebody's reading a biography over a backing track. This is probably one of the most diverse albums this band put out in the 1980s, I think. Number 9 is Brave New World from 2000. This originally ranked at number 6 in my listing. This, of course, is the album that marks the return of Bruce Dickinson, heralded by fans and critics alike. Powerful songs, lots of melodic riffs, and some wonderful 3-guitar interplay. It's a real statement of intent, which was needed from this band, I think, after the Blaze Bayley era. I love the artwork on this. I love the fact that they've merged that iconic Derek Riggs Eddie with some of the digital photography of Steve Stone. A statement of intent, I suppose, for this band for the new millennia. If I'm not mistaken, actually, some of the tracks from this album were unused or reworkings of tracks that actually thought about for the Virtual 11 album. Songs like The Nomad, Dream of Mirrors, and The Mercenary. Number 8 is Iron Maiden, the debut album from 1980, which has moved up considerably from my original ranking where I placed it at number 11. This is a very important album. It's one of those canonical texts in that weighty tome known as the new wave of British heavy metal, and it keeps bloody good company as well. If you think about it, 1980, I think, saw the release of Motorhead's Ace of Spades, Saxon's Wheels of Steel, and if I'm not mistaken, Judas Priest also released British Steel at this point. Ian Christie said this album's imbued with a sense of English fog, cobblestones. It's like visiting the London dungeons. And it's a refreshing album. New wave of British heavy metal was incredibly refreshing at this juncture, as a lot of the old stars were kind of losing their way. Alice Cooper was very much burnt out, and Kiss had gone all disco on us. This album represents a new high-energy, high-octane vision for metal. It contains wonderful tracks like Running Free and Phantom of the Opera, which are still fan favourites, and I think occasionally might even find their way into the set list even to this day. The production was by a chap called Will Malone. I believe this is the only appearance on vinyl from Iron Maiden from Dennis Stratton. I could be wrong there. But it does also have a very punky vibe, which might be Di'Anno's influence. Of course, Maiden went out and supported Kiss at this juncture, while Kiss had just released their Unmasked album. My word, what an interesting juxtaposition that must have been. Number 7 is Killers from 1981, originally ranked at number 10 in my original ranking video. So this one is another one that's been moved up as well. Sonically, I think this album takes a step up from their debut album, probably due to the inclusion of Martin Birch on production details. Although Paul Di'Anno has said that he felt this album was a little bit too fancy, maybe he was uncomfortable with his metal persona, who knows. This album does boast the wonderful Wrathchild and Genghis Khan, and it certainly puts out a marker in terms of where this band were going, and paves the way, I think, for the absolute brilliance that was Number of the Beast. Number 6 is Senjutsu from 2021. This has the potential to be the greatest of Maiden's later albums. Very heavy and hooky. I love Dickinson's voice, and it's weathered and darker, but perfectly suits the grunginess of the music. Great artwork by Mark Wilkinson. If you haven't checked out my interview with Mark where he discusses working with Iron Maiden, there is a card up there for you to do just that. The problems I have with this album is I think some of the tracks are too long and just extended unnecessarily with these what have become rather cliched Maiden musical motifs. The sound is way too sludgy and Bruce Dickinson's voice is way too low in the mix. But nevertheless an absolutely fabulous album. Number 5 is Book of Souls from 2015. This originally ranked at number 4. Classic Rock said of this album, it was difficult to imagine any band of this vintage producing music that was this powerful and this inspired. And I think they're absolutely spot on. It's a cerebral, evocative and arresting album. In fact, the opening track, If Eternity Should Fail, it would easily make my top 10 all-time best favourite Maiden numbers. And I love Empire of the Clouds. I know this is a polarising number for many Maiden fans, but I think it's absolutely fabulous. All credit to Bruce Dickinson for this one. Of course, it tells the story of that ill-fated journey by airship R101 that crashed on its maiden voyage, no pun intended. And again, I love the artwork on this one, all tribute to Mark Wilkinson. I love its nod to that ancient Mayan civilization. Some wonderful tracks on this album, you know, for example, If Eternity Should Fail, I've already mentioned The Red and the Black, Book of Souls and Empire of the Clouds. Listening to those 4 tracks alone epitomises for me why this album is just so good. Number 4 is Number of the Beast from 1982, originally ranked at number 5. This is the album that introduced a lot of fans to this band, yours truly included. I distinctly remember watching them doing Run to the Hills on Top of the Pops with that famous Maiden gallop. It's absolutely fabulous. Some absolutely stunning tracks on this album, Hallowed Be Thy Name, Children of the Damned, and of course that reading of the Book of Revelation. So it introduces perhaps the most iconic number ever. Interesting, I read somewhere that Invaders was never performed live, or perhaps as rarely performed live. I'll leave that out there for you Maidenologists to refute in the comments below. The only weak track on this album, the only weak link as far as I'm concerned, is the track Gangland. Number 3 is Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, which was released in 1988 and was originally at number 3 on my ranking video, so no movement there. This is a well-paced, high-quality Maiden album, and all the tracks link so well, inspired by Orson Scott Card's fantasy novel, as well as a healthy interest in occultist Aleister Crowley. This album possesses the quality of Number of the Beast, the energy of Powerslave, and the diversity of Somewhere in Time. Those feeling somewhat befuddled by the narrative or story of this, Bruce Dickinson has gone on record to saying that there is no story, there is no narrative. It's really thematically just about the fight between good and evil, which pretty much summarises a lot of Maiden's albums, doesn't it? It's just an album that sounds fantastic, you know, the production is wonderful, from those opening acoustic chords that ring out like cathedral bells to some of the heavier moments. Standout tracks on this, Got to Be the Evil That Men Do and The Clairvoyant, inspired by Doris Stokes. When you talk about standout tracks on this album, the whole album is just standout tracks. Number 2 is Powerslave from 1984, which was originally ranked at number 2. This album is a real tour de force, and it establishes Maiden as a really powerful and impressive live act, of course captured beautifully on their Live After Death album. Sonically, this takes a step up from Peace of Mind. It just sounds cinematic. And it hosts perhaps 2 of my favourite Maiden numbers, which is Powerslave and Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This is arguably the band's most energetic of albums, containing 2 Minutes to Midnight and Aces High, as well as those wonderful conceptual pieces I've just mentioned. And the number 1 slot is still inhabited by Peace of Mind from 1983. I personally feel this album is a step up from Number of the Beast. It's hard to imagine improving on such a wonderful record. But this album, Number of the Beast is a transitional album, really. It's a band re-emerging or redefining themselves with this wonderful new singer. This album feels a little bit more confident, I think, certainly in terms of the writing. It's also the first album to feature Nico McBrain, who comes in at this juncture. I love the themes of madness and insanity and insane ideas. And it contains the Galloping Trooper, which is an iconic Maiden number, probably based on Charge of the Light Brigade or the Crimean War in general. And of course the wonderful Flight of Icarus. This, in my opinion, is Maiden's best album, although Powerslave is kind of in the same ballpark, really. Although Powerslave does sound better, in my opinion. There you have it. That's my fully updated ranking of the Iron Maiden albums. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to click like, subscribe, and do all that stuff. Other than that, I just hope you're staying well, staying healthy, and more importantly that you keep listening.